As she stood before the massive gates, a bitter thought crossed her mind: there was no happiness left in the world. It had been years since she last glimpsed the outside, and now, it felt like she was finally leaving the prison that had held her. Her appearance was pitiful, hands bound to a pillory, her body weak, and her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The crowd surrounding her began to jeer, shouting insults and calling her a criminal. Someone flung a rotten apple her way, sneering and mocking her with a sarcastic wish for a happy marriage. Voices continued to hurl taunts, saying her new home would suit her perfectly. Mud splattered onto her as she stood silently, enduring the abuse. Inwardly, she surrendered to her fate, convinced that someone like her, marked as a criminal, had no right to resist. This, she thought, would be the final chapter in a life stained by hatred. She climbed into the waiting carriage, feeling a strange relief at the thought of leaving the kingdom, yet an unsettling fear lingered. The crowd's parting words echoed in her mind, wishing her well with the Beast King. Her thoughts darkened as she considered her destination, the land of the beastkin, where creatures known to hunt humans resided. Her homeland, the kingdom of Ford, was a human realm, but beyond its borders lay the beastkin territory, a domain inhabited by wolves. The beastkin were formidable, towering over humans, with wolf heads, sharp fangs, and powerful claws. Decades ago, a fierce conflict had ended in a tense Cold War between the two nations, and only recently had diplomatic relations been rekindled. Yet, no human dared to enter the land of wolves, fearing they'd be devoured. And now, she had been chosen as a bride for their king. The protagonist couldn't fathom why the Beast King would want her, a mere criminal. Meanwhile, the citizens of Ford celebrated, eager to be rid of her by sending her off to the wolves. Fear crept into her heart, and she let out a hollow laugh, realizing she was dressed as if for a funeral. Her brief amusement quickly faded, tears filling her eyes as she thought, I'm not a bride, I'm a sacrifice. The carriage came to a sudden halt, jolting her painfully forward. Before she could collect her thoughts, a guard roughly pulled her out, hastily unfastening her from the pillory. His face betrayed fear as he declared he wouldn't dare venture any deeper into the land of wolves. Without waiting for her response, he climbed back into the carriage and fled, leaving her alone at the edge of the dense forest. This was her chance, she thought. If she were to escape, it had to be now. But as she looked around, the encroaching darkness of the jungle filled her with dread. She took a hesitant step forward, unsure of where to go, her heart pounding. The distant cries of animals sent chills down her spine, her fear mounting with every step. Suddenly, she heard a rustling behind her, a wild boar. Her heart raced as she turned to see it charging at her, and before she knew it, she was knocked to the ground. Overcome by terror, she began to cry, wondering if this was truly where her life would end. But then, out of nowhere, a beastkin tore the boar apart before her eyes. The gruesome sight only heightened her fear as she watched the creature's blood-soaked claws glint in the moonlight. She trembled uncontrollably, realizing she was in the presence of a beastkin. Its piercing gaze locked onto her, and it demanded to know what a human was doing in its territory. Her voice shaking, she managed to stammer that she had been summoned by the king and that the carriage had left her nearby. The beastkin scowled, clicking its tongue in irritation, muttering that the rumors about humans being scum must be true. She flinched, frightened by his disdain and imposing presence. Then, to her astonishment, he introduced himself as Alfred Velkarthus, the king of the land of wolves and the one meant to be her husband. Shock washed over her as she glanced at the lifeless boar, realizing that it was he who had killed it. Her mind reeled at the impossibility of it all, her legs wobbled, and before she could process anything further, she fainted. Alarmed, Alfred called out to her, but she was already unconscious. In her dream, she saw her mother, who opened a window and urged her to wake up. She smiled, basking in the warmth of her mother's voice, and sleepily complained about the brightness. But then reality crashed down on her like icy water. Her mother had died long ago. She jolted awake, disoriented, with tears welling in her eyes, fear once again gripping her heart. As she regained consciousness, the protagonist found herself staring up at a fearsome beastkin woman who stood over her, remarking with a smirk that she was finally awake. Terror surged through her body, and she began to tremble, petrified by the towering, wolf-like figure before her. Her voice caught in her throat, and she could barely stammer out a response, realizing she was face to face with yet another beastkin. In her panic, she tried to scramble away, but her frantic movements caused her to slip off the bed, accidentally tugging the tablecloth with her as she fell. A water jug toppled, spilling cold water over her, and she gasped, feeling even more disoriented. Glancing around, she struggled to believe this was real. Seeing her sprawled on the floor, the maid teased her, asking if she was playing hide-and-seek, which only made the protagonist more anxious. She realized she must have been taken to the beastkin castle after fainting. The maid then informed her that the king was waiting and that it was already time for lunch. The protagonist's panic deepened as she remembered she was now married to the king of the land of wolves. In desperation, she tried to make a dash for the door, but the maid caught her hand, insisting it was time to eat and pulling her back. Leading her to a mirror, the maid commented that it would be hard to dine in her current state. The protagonist shuddered, unsure what the maid meant, her mind racing with fear. When the maid offered to help her change, she quickly declined, frantically changing on her own. As she dressed, the maid remarked on her thin frame, suggesting she needed more meat on her bones, which only fueled the protagonist's terror as she imagined what that might mean. Once dressed, the maid placed her in front of the mirror again, commenting on her soft skin and how they would need to take special care of it from now on. Hearing this, the protagonist's anxiety spiked, assuming she was being prepared as a meal. The maid continued, lightly dusting her face with powder and blush, explaining that the king preferred a natural look and disliked heavy makeup. The protagonist's heart pounded, convinced she was being groomed to be devoured. Soon after, she was led into the dining hall, where the beastkin king Alfred awaited her. His imposing presence made her too nervous to speak, and her gaze shifted to the large plate at the center of the table. Fear twisted in her stomach. Was she to be the main course? Alfred greeted her and invited her to sit, but she hesitated, worried that if she ate, it would make her gain weight, only to end up on that platter. Sensing her reluctance, Alfred asked if she wasn't hungry, then called for the chef. Overwhelmed with terror, she finally blurted out, begging him not to eat her. Alfred sighed, clearly understanding her fear, and tried to reassure her. But her panic only grew, fearing she had angered him. He instructed her to sit closer to him, as the table was too wide for conversation, and she moved reluctantly, still trembling. When the chef arrived, Alfred ordered her portion to be brought, along with the main course. Her heart raced, convinced she was about to be served up as the meal. But finally, noticing her horrified expression, Alfred told her to stop looking as if she were preparing to die and clarified that the beastkin did not eat humans. She blinked in shock, stunned by his words. The chef placed the food on the table, and the protagonist stared, unsure of what to believe. Alfred assured her that the meal shouldn't be too different from human food. Hesitantly, she glanced at the dishes: salad, soup, bread, and even meat. All of it looked surprisingly familiar. When Alfred slid a plate toward her, he explained that it was customary for the head of the family to cut and serve the food, which only confused her further. He urged her to eat before the food got cold, so she took a tentative sip of the soup. To her surprise, it was delicious, and her face lit up in spite of herself. Observing her reaction, Alfred remarked that it was only soup, but she shook her head, explaining that in prison, she had only ever been given hard bread and cold, watery soup. His expression darkened, and she sensed his anger at the cruelty she had endured at the hands of other humans. After the meal, she marveled at how similar the food had been to a human meal. Her earlier fears began to wane, and she wondered if perhaps the beastkin really didn't eat people after all. Just as she was beginning to relax, Alfred instructed her to go and take a bath. Panic flared up once again, and she thought with terror that this must be it, that she was being prepared for consumption after all. Seeing her hesitation, Alfred clarified that it was simply important to stay clean, but she was still uneasy. As she followed the maid down the hallway, she noticed several beastkin servants watching her, and their murmurs drifted through the air. They whispered, questioning what the king was thinking, and it was clear they were talking about her. Her heart raced, realizing how isolated and vulnerable she truly was among these strangers. Her maid called her, leading her toward a door, and the protagonist's pulse quickened. She knew this might be her last chance to escape. As she came to her senses, she flinched and followed the maid hesitantly, unsure of what awaited her. When the door opened, she was taken aback. The bathroom was stunning, far beyond anything she had imagined. For a moment, she felt a flicker of happiness as she marveled at its grandeur. She caught a faint scent of roses and curiously asked the maid about it. The maid confirmed it, explaining that His Highness loved roses. Hearing this made her heart race. The maid went on, describing how the rose petals were meticulously selected and arranged to infuse the bathwater with their fragrance, assuring her that it would be a lovely experience. But the protagonist's unease lingered, and she couldn't shake her fear. She recalled the rose-scented tea and cake, and once again, she feared this was all part of some ritual to prepare her to be eaten. The maid urged her to hurry, but she hesitated, instinctively taking a step back. With a sigh, the maid assured her that they truly weren't planning to eat her, but even so, the protagonist found it hard to believe. Urged to get in before the water cooled, she flinched again, reluctantly undressed, and sank into the warm bath. To her surprise, she began to relax, admitting to herself that it felt wonderful, even if it conflicted with everything she'd been taught about the beastkin. In that brief moment of calm, her fear softened, and the world around her seemed less frightening. Then, an unusual noise caught her attention, making her heart pound. She looked up, only to see Alfred entering the bathroom. Her terror surged once more, her mind racing with the fear that he had finally given in to his hunger. The maid, Roses, tried to intervene, scolding him for barging in so suddenly, but it did little to calm her nerves. Alfred asked if she'd warmed up, which only made her panic more. In a desperate attempt to escape, she grabbed a towel and tried to flee, but he reached out to stop her, warning that she might slip. Jerking her hand free, she shouted for him to let go. Alfred, realizing the depth of her fear, knelt down and apologized, acknowledging that his fur and claws might be intimidating to her. He suggested she return to the bath, but she remained frozen, her gaze locked onto his sharp claws. The sight of them triggered a painful memory, a flashback to her mother's death, torn apart by beastkin claws. Her body trembled, and tears filled her eyes as she recounted the horrific scene that had stolen her mother's life. Alfred, understanding her pain, drew back his hand and looked at his claws thoughtfully. "Do you fear my claws?" he asked softly. She gasped, collapsing into sobs, still clutching the towel around her. Overcome with grief and haunted by the tragic loss of her mother, she couldn't hold back the flood of emotions. Sensing the depth of her trauma, Alfred gripped his dagger, a gesture that made her and even the maid, Roses, nervous. Roses pleaded with him not to act rashly. But to her astonishment, instead of lashing out, Alfred used the dagger to cut his claws down. She watched in shock, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Roses, equally astonished, remarked that the Beast King had never cut his claws before. Still reeling, the protagonist wondered why he would do something so drastic. The maid explained that a beastkin's claws were symbols of pride, strength, and nobility, an essential part of their identity. She was taken aback, struggling to understand why Alfred would part with something so significant for her sake. The maid continued, explaining that while beastkin claws were a mark of strength, they could also cause harm. Alfred had chosen to cut them to ease her fear. Deeply confused and unable to understand his motivations, the protagonist stared at him. After cutting his claws, Alfred turned to her and asked if this was less frightening, extending his now blunted hand. She felt a slight sense of relief but was still weighed down by guilt, feeling somehow responsible for his sacrifice. As he reached out to her again, another flashback of her mother's death gripped her, reigniting her fear. Alfred gently stroked her face, and in that quiet moment, she began to question the absolute terror she had once felt. He reassured her, saying that there was no need to rush and that he would help her see that not all beastkin were so terrifying. She shyly averted her gaze as he spoke, mentioning softly that if she stayed out of the bath too long, she might catch a cold. Suddenly, her towel slipped, leaving her exposed, and in a panic, she quickly pulled the curtain between them. Alfred reminded her that he was her husband and that she needn't be so shy or hide from him. As he approached, her anxiety spiked, and she screamed for him to stay away. Startled by her loud cry, he paused, clearly confused. He explained that grooming among beastkin families was normal, an innocent gesture in his culture. Sensing the tension, the maid stepped in, saying that it was enough for one day and gently ushered Alfred out of the bathroom despite his protests. Left alone, the maid encouraged her to finish her bath, showing her how to use the rose petal pouch and reminding her not to hesitate if the water was too hot. Still shaken but willing to trust her maid's guidance, the protagonist complied and continued her bath. Later that night, lying in bed, she reflected on the overwhelming events of the day. Just that morning, she had been in prison, surrounded by people who spoke of the beastkin as terrifying and bloodthirsty creatures. Yet today, she had witnessed something entirely unexpected. King Alfred, a beastkin, had even cut his prized claws to ease her fear. It didn't align with anything she'd believed about the beastkin. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by a gasp as anxiety flared up again. She sat upright, heart pounding, as she heard footsteps approaching her room. Panic surged through her, recalling the murmurs and gossip she had overheard from the maids earlier. She froze as the footsteps stopped just outside her door. As she lay trembling in bed, she heard the footsteps pause outside her door. Her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. What if it was another beastkin? She feared she might meet the same fate as her mother, torn apart by claws. Although she felt some trust toward the king and her maid, Hannah, she wasn't sure about the other beastkin in the castle. In desperation, she pulled the blanket over herself, shaking with fear and silently praying for the footsteps to retreat. After a tense silence, she finally heard the sound of the footsteps moving away, and a sense of relief washed over her. She whispered a quiet thanks, grateful for this momentary reprieve. Still trembling, she lay under the blanket, trying to convince herself that she was safe, at least for tonight. But her thoughts spiraled with dread. What about tomorrow, or the day after? She barely slept, her fear gnawing at her through the long hours of the night. Days passed like this, and one morning, the maid cheerfully announced fresh milk for breakfast. But the protagonist was pale and exhausted. She hadn't slept in 5 nights. The maid noticed immediately, asking if she felt unwell. Dizzy and weak, the protagonist tried to brush it off, but before she could finish her sentence, she wobbled and fainted. When she came to, she found herself staring up at Alfred. Startled, she sat upright in a panic, stammering an apology. But he gently told her to lie back down, his expression concerned. He asked what had happened, and after a moment of hesitation, she confessed everything about her sleepless nights and the constant fear that had consumed her. Alfred sighed deeply, and she flinched, thinking he was angry. "Yes, I am angry," he admitted, which made her shrink back, "but not at you." He was upset that she had been suffering alone without him knowing. He extended his hand and asked her to come with him. Though she was hesitant, she placed her hand in his, her heart pounding as they walked. She couldn't help but worry, where was he taking her? The unfamiliar atmosphere felt heavy, stirring memories of her old prison. She wondered fearfully if he was about to lock her up for causing trouble. But instead, he led her to a grand bedroom. To her surprise, the room reminded her of her old home, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of calm. She asked where they were, and he explained that this was his secret room. She was stunned to learn that she was the only other person he had ever brought here, and he added that it was connected to his private quarters. Still confused, she asked why he had brought her to this hidden room. Alfred explained that the castle guards didn't come here, so she could sleep peacefully, without fear of interruption. She looked at him, astonished, and asked if he had really done all this for her. He nodded, observing that she still looked unwell and should rest. After he left, she felt a wave of relief, grateful for his kindness even if she was shyly unsure why he'd gone to such lengths for her. That night, for the first time in days, she slept soundly. When she woke the next morning, she stretched, feeling genuinely rested. As she lay there, however, lingering doubts surfaced in her mind. Later, Alfred entered the room, greeting her with a warm smile and a simple good morning. She shyly returned the greeting, feeling a confusing mix of gratitude and nervousness. That evening, she noticed Alfred sleeping on the couch. A pang of guilt struck her. She didn't like the thought of making the king sleep on such an uncomfortable spot. She climbed down from the bed, intending to tell him to take the bed instead. But as she approached, he suddenly reached out and caught her hand, startling her. Seeing her unease, he asked if she couldn't sleep. She nervously fidgeted, suggesting that he should take the bed while she would sleep on the couch. But Alfred firmly refused, reminding her that he would never allow his wife to sleep on a couch. Gathering her courage, she shyly blurted out, "Then I can't let my husband sleep on a couch, either." A heavy silence fell between them after her outburst. Alfred blushed and averted his gaze, clearly flustered at being called husband. He mumbled something about her stubbornness, while she began to worry, wondering if she had overstepped. Then, he extended his hand toward her and asked if they should just share the bed, causing her to gasp in surprise. He reached out to gently touch her face, but she flinched, still unsure why his touch made her uneasy despite her attempts to calm herself. Noticing her reaction, Alfred pulled back, a hint of sadness in his expression. With a faint, bittersweet smile, he said he'd only been joking about sharing the bed. Then, with a quiet good night, he turned and settled back on the couch, leaving her feeling unsettled and guilty. She lay back in bed, troubled by the thought that she seemed to keep causing him disappointment. Trying to distract herself, she picked up a book to read, but her mind drifted back to Alfred. When the maid brought tea, she refused, her thoughts still tangled with guilt and confusion. Determined to stop troubling him, she resolved not to return to his room again. She nervously locked her door that night, hoping it would keep her from wandering back to him as she lay there, struggling to sleep. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to will herself to sleep, but the moment she heard footsteps again, her eyes flew open and her body tensed. Curling up in fear, she trembled, whispering to herself that everything would be fine, that no harm would come to her. But the anxiety wouldn't leave her, and the next morning, her face was pale and her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. As she prepared for breakfast, she worried about what Alfred might think if he saw her in such a state. When she asked the maid about his whereabouts, she was told that he had important work and wouldn't be joining her. She felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment, sitting down alone for her meal. The food was good, but she couldn't shake her lingering fatigue and unease. Without fully realizing why, she found herself walking toward Alfred's secret room. A thought had struck her: he had been sleeping on that uncomfortable couch all this time. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise at the sight of a much larger bed. Alfred was there, and he noticed her surprise, asking why she hadn't come the previous night and if something was wrong. She fidgeted, nervously explaining that she wanted him to sleep in the bed instead of on the couch. He stepped closer, observing how concerned she seemed for him, and he smiled, clearly touched. She admitted it was because he was always so busy with work. He seemed pleased by her words and told her he'd thought of a solution. Confused, she watched as he took her hand and explained that he knew she was still afraid of the beastkin, so he'd had the bed expanded even further. With the bed now large enough to accommodate them both comfortably, there would be no need for either of them to sleep on the couch. She realized he had gone to all this trouble to make her feel safe, and when he gently stroked her face, he reassured her that he wouldn't do anything to make her uncomfortable. She blushed, but his calm presence put her at ease. That night, lying in the spacious bed next to him, she couldn't help but think how much effort he had made for her, despite his own busy life. As strange as it seemed, she felt safe. Gradually, she drifted off to sleep, but she woke in the middle of the night to find herself in his arms. Alfred had wrapped her in a gentle embrace while he slept. Her heart raced as she tried to understand the situation, her face warming with a blush. Why was he holding her like this? She lay still, feeling shy and unsure of what to do, but as she listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, she realized it sounded remarkably similar to a human's. The beastkin weren't as terrifying as she'd once believed. After a moment, she decided to try to shift away. His arm felt heavy, but as she wriggled, it slipped slightly, giving her just enough space to move. But before she could fully pull away, Alfred instinctively drew her back into an even tighter embrace. She froze, uncertain of what to do, but as she caught his scent, a warm, comforting smell that reminded her of the sun, she found herself relaxing. His fur brushed against her cheek, soft and inviting. A sudden thought crossed her mind: would he mind if she touched it? Tentatively, she reached out and gently ran her fingers through his fur, finding it softer than she'd expected. For a brief moment, panic flared: had she woken him? But then he gave a soft growl, and she wondered if he might actually be enjoying it. Smiling to herself, she felt a wave of nostalgia, reminded of a dog she once knew. It had been so long since she felt this kind of warmth and companionship. Then, Alfred yawned, revealing his sharp wolfish teeth, and she instinctively jerked back, startled. In her haste, she accidentally slipped and tumbled out of the bed, landing on the floor with a thud. The noise woke Alfred, and he looked over, asking if she had fallen out of bed. Embarrassed, she quickly apologized, her face flushing as he extended a hand to help her up, teasing her about the dangers of sleeping near the edge. Hesitantly, she took his hand, her embarrassment deepening. Once he helped her back into bed, he admitted he had been trying to keep her from falling out, which was why he'd held her so closely. Apologizing again, she blushed, feeling foolish. Alfred pointed out that she was still lying near the edge, and, flustered, she quickly blurted out that she'd sleep in her own room from now on to avoid any more awkwardness. As she hurried back to her room, her mind raced, replaying the night's events and feeling embarrassed over her reactions. She couldn't believe she'd been so close to him like that. But as she recalled the warmth of his embrace and the kindness he had shown her, she let out a soft sigh of relief. Despite her lingering fears, his presence was beginning to feel strangely comforting. Just then, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hushed voices nearby. Instinctively, she hid, peeking around the corner to see two beastkin maids conversing. The tone of their voices made her heart race as she strained to listen. One maid, sounding frustrated, questioned what the prince was thinking. The other scoffed, expressing disdain at the idea of a human like her being in the castle. Her anxiety spiked, realizing they were talking about her. One of the maids urged the other to quiet down, cautioning her about being overheard, but the frustrated maid continued, her voice bitter and resentful, hinting at a potentially dire outcome if the human continued to stay. The protagonist's fear intensified at the ominous words she'd overheard, sooner or later. She began to tremble, her worst fears resurfacing. They were planning to eat her, exactly the fate she had been so afraid of, despite Alfred's reassurances. Her mind spiraled as she recalled the cruelty she had faced in the past, the feeling of being a burden, unwanted everywhere she went. Now, even here in this grand castle, that same sense of dread weighed heavily on her. The maids' voices continued, their disapproval evident as they questioned why the prince would marry a human. Then one maid made a passing comment, saying, "Those who won't work, won't eat." The protagonist latched onto those words, turning them over in her mind. They resented her not only for being human but for seeming idle and useless as well. That thought struck her deeply, sparking a realization. If she wanted to survive here, maybe there was something she could do to change her situation. The maids went on, one of them remarking that humans were lazy, and that if she continued to be a burden, she might soon find herself in trouble. The implication was clear, and she shivered in fear, feeling she couldn't let things continue like this. Pale and anxious, she clenched her fists, resolving to find some kind of work to make herself useful. The next day, she noticed her maid, Hannah, busy with chores. Gathering her courage, she approached and hesitantly asked if she could help. Hannah looked taken aback, shocked at the suggestion, and reminded her that someone of her status shouldn't be doing menial tasks. She urged the protagonist to sit down and rest. Feeling awkward but undeterred, the protagonist tried again, only to be politely but firmly turned down. Hannah explained that these chores were her own responsibilities and gently directed the protagonist back to her room. Dejected, she walked away, feeling helpless and frustrated. That night, holding a candle to steady her, she made her way nervously to Alfred's room. She didn't know how he would react to her request, and feared that if he turned her away too, she'd be out of options. Knocking hesitantly on his door, she entered when he called her in, noticing the concern in his voice as he invited her out of the cold and handed her a cup of tea. The warmth of the tea helped calm her nerves, and as she sipped, she felt a small sense of ease. But when he sat beside her, gently pulling her closer in a comforting gesture, she stiffened, feeling flustered by the sudden closeness. She shyly pulled back, assuring him that she was fine. When he asked if there was something on her mind, she took a deep breath, setting her tea aside. With a determined expression, she bowed her head and boldly requested that he assign her some kind of job. Alfred looked shocked, clearly confused by her request, and demanded an explanation. She hesitated, unable to tell him the truth about the maid's cruel words, so she instead told him about her past in prison, how she had done chores like washing floors and laundry, though she'd been beaten until she'd learned to do them properly. She insisted that she was capable and wanted to help. Alfred's expression darkened as he absorbed her words, anger flashing in his eyes as he realized the harsh treatment she had endured. Before she could react, he reached out and pulled her into a protective embrace. He reassured her that she was his wife and that all he wanted was for her to stay by his side. His words made her blush, her thoughts racing as she considered what it truly meant to be his wife. Did he mean giving him descendants? The thought of bearing his children filled her with shy panic, and in a flustered response, she suddenly pushed him away. Realizing what she had done, she gasped, her face burning as she quickly apologized, flustered and embarrassed. But Alfred only smiled gently, taking her hand and kissing it softly, telling her not to worry. His kindness overwhelmed her, bringing tears to her eyes as she wondered why he was always so compassionate, despite everything. With a small smile, Alfred suggested playfully that they could hold hands and sleep together, offering it as a job only his wife could do. The protagonist, flustered and embarrassed, immediately protested, saying that wasn't a real job. Still smiling, Alfred reassured her, explaining that it was a role only she could fill, and softly held her hands. He then shifted the conversation, asking why she was so intent on finding work. Caught off guard, she hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She couldn't tell him the truth about the maid's cruel comments, fearing they might be punished if he found out. Trying to avoid the real reason, she began to stammer, struggling to come up with an answer. Sensing her discomfort, Alfred asked gently if it was something she couldn't share with him. His question jolted her, and she realized she needed to give him some kind of explanation. With a nervous smile, she looked up at him and apologized for not contributing since her arrival at the castle. She explained that she felt guilty for not being useful, especially when everyone around her worked so hard.